Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history.
The formation of the American Republic, celebrated in sweeping declarations and revolutionary fervor, was swiftly followed by the less dramatic, yet infinitely more complex, necessity of governance. The enduring structures of statecraft were not built on rhetoric alone, but upon the dull, grinding weight of arithmetic and documentation. The most fundamental premise of the new government, representation, depended entirely upon a reliable count of the people, a requirement enshrined in Article 1, Section 2 of the newly ratified Constitution. This mandate, simply stated as an enumeration every 10 years, planted the philosophical seed for the vast statistical bureaucracy that would define the nation's growth. The administrative challenge, however, was monumental, transforming this philosophical mandate into a physical reality across a decentralized, suspicious, and rapidly expanding populace. The first practical step was the drafting and passage of the Census Act of 1790. This was not a document of grand vision, but one of practical, almost sparse legislation. It defined the procedural framework for the initial count, setting the clock for the monumental task. The enumeration was to be completed within 9 calendar months from the first Monday in August 1790. The act meticulously detailed the obligation placed upon every inhabitant of the new nation to answer the queries of the federal agent truthfully and fully. Crucially, it assigned specific penalties, ranging from fines for noncompliance to dismissal for official negligence, thus asserting the federal government's legal right to penetrate the local domain for administrative purposes. The very establishment of this legislative framework marked the genesis of inquiry, formalizing the state's power to ask questions and demand answers on a nationwide scale. For the nascent federal administration, headquartered temporarily in New York and then Philadelphia, the immediate concern was finding an appropriate mechanism to execute this count. The government lacked a dedicated civil service, a police force, or a standardized network of federal officers spanning the 13 states. The solution was pragmatic and opportunistic. The task was delegated to the United States Marshals. These were the officers already charged with judicial enforcement within defined districts, possessing a chain of command, however rudimentary, already in place. The marshals were tasked with recruiting and appointing the true foot soldiers of the statistical campaign, the assistant enumerators. The administrative delegation was direct, but the funding was meager. The marshals were authorized to pay the assistant enumerators a small sum, calculated on a per capita basis, a meager compensation that was frequently contingent upon successful collection and prompt return of the data. This transactional relationship, payment directly tied to the number of heads counted, introduced a foundational element of potential inconsistency, prioritizing volume of figures over absolute methodological rigor. The assistant enumerator, often a local magistrate, a property owner, or a prominent citizen selected for his literacy and local knowledge, became the crucial interface between the distant federal authority and the distrustful local resident. The instrument of inquiry itself, the form specified by the Act, was the ultimate reflection of the census's limited constitutional purpose. The information sought was minimal, constrained by the political mandate for apportionment and by the administrative capacity of the new government. The form required only 5 rudimentary categories, focusing solely on the population structure: the name of the head of the family, the count of free white males aged 16 years and upward, including heads of families, free white males under 16 years, free white females, including heads of families, all other free persons, and slaves. The categories themselves, particularly the distinction based on age, race, and legal status, codified the social and political structure of the young republic, revealing the dual purpose of the count, to both apportion political power and to document the foundational demographics of a society still reliant upon chattel slavery. The challenge of documentation was immense. The federal government did not possess the centralized means to mass produce and distribute printed forms to thousands of enumerators across a continent. Consequently, the assistant enumerators were frequently required to hand copy or hand draw the specified columns and headers onto whatever paper was locally available. This reliance on manuscript duplication introduced a significant, inevitable element of non-uniformity into the primary sources. A ledger from a well-established mercantile town might be neatly inscribed on smooth imported linen paper using professional ink, while a return from a remote district might be hastily scribbled on thick, rough paper using gallnut ink that was prone to fading or flaking. The physical execution of the count was a logistical nightmare that speaks directly to the primitive state of early American infrastructure. The assistant enumerator was required to travel through their entire assigned subdivision, navigating poor roads, isolated settlements, and treacherous terrain, often on foot or by rudimentary horse-drawn conveyance. The process was slow, arduous, and subject to the vagaries of climate, geography, and personal persistence. The data, once collected, did not move via rapid digital transfer, but by the slow, rhythmic movement of post riders and, in some cases, coastal sloops. The 9-month deadline, ambitious even for a smaller population, was often surpassed, resulting in delays that compounded the administrative workload in the central federal offices. The administrative struggle of the 1790s extended beyond the census. The burgeoning Treasury Department, under the meticulous command of Alexander Hamilton, concurrently established its own foundational mechanism for record-keeping, the tracking of foreign trade and tariffs. This involved issuing detailed directives to the newly appointed customs collectors in port cities. Unlike the temporary census marshals, the customs collectors were permanent federal employees, tasked with maintaining fastidious, continuous records of all goods entering and exiting the nation. This was record-keeping designed not for head count, but for fiscal survival. Hamilton's forms demanded a high level of granular detail, requiring collectors to classify goods, textiles, rum, sugar, using complex systems that often conflicted with local mercantile vernacular. The result was a constant low-level administrative friction between the federal demand for methodological precision and the local reality of commercial expediency. Collectors' quarterly returns were frequently late or incomplete, filled with abbreviations, non-standardized units, and figures that required significant clerical reconciliation upon arrival in Philadelphia. The cumulative effect of these disjointed efforts, the census, the customs reports, the judicial documentation, was the unintended creation of a preliminary federal network. It was a network not of physical wires or roads, but of paper, ink, and procedural expectation. The marshals, the enumerators, the post riders, and the customs collectors formed the nodes of this vast, decentralized system. Though the data collected was rife with inconsistencies and errors by modern standards, the fundamental achievement of the decade was the institutionalization of the administrative habit of inquiry. The government, through the precise language of the law and the tired, slow work of its foot soldiers, had permanently established its legal and administrative mechanism to ask, record, and quantify the American experience. The genesis was complete, and the slow, steady hum of bureaucracy had begun its decades-long task of charting the Republic. The procedural legacy of this decade cannot be overstated. It was the moment when the abstract ideals of the Constitution were first translated into the concrete, dry reality of columns and figures. The subsequent decades would refine the forms, expand the questions, and improve the logistics, but the basic mechanism for head count and representation, the legal mandate, the hierarchical delegation of authority, and the reliance on local citizens to collect data was born between 1790 and 1800. This foundational framework, built upon the simple, essential necessity of knowing how many, served as the rough yet durable statistical cornerstone for the continental nation that would follow.
The shift of the calendar from the 18th to the 19th century did not merely mark a temporal change for the American Republic. It signaled a profound administrative transition from the foundational necessity of a head count to the fiscal imperative of economic quantification.
Having established the mechanism for counting its populace, the federal government now faced the far more intricate challenge of measuring the vast, scattered output that constituted its economic engine. The stability of the nation was, in this era, intrinsically tied to the predictable flow of revenue, and that revenue was overwhelmingly derived from tariffs levied on foreign trade. Thus, the documentation of what left the port became as critical as the enumeration of what resided in the field. The new administrative demand was formalized and rigorously enforced by the Treasury Department, particularly under the methodical and influential tenure of Albert Gallatin, Treasury Secretary from 1801. Gallatin recognized that vague, intermittent reports were insufficient for accurate revenue forecasting or the maintenance of international financial credibility. His directives to the federal officers marked a shift in focus, moving from simply noting the presence of goods to demanding precise, verifiable data on their quantity, type, and value. The goal was simple in concept: to transfer the raw reality of commerce from port to paper, but its execution exposed deep administrative flaws rooted in local practice. The central figure in this documentation effort was the customs collector. Situated in every major coastal and lake port, this permanent federal official became the indispensable nexus of economic data. The collector transitioned from a mere gatekeeper of taxation to the meticulous manager of national statistics. Their expanded role required them to oversee not only the collection of duties, but also the rigorous creation of a paper trail detailing all exports. The process, slow and subject to the physical limitations of the time, involved the meticulous recording of commodities that financed the nation's entire import trade. The most persistent administrative hurdle was the fundamental struggle for uniformity. The agricultural and commercial practices of the early republic operated on highly decentralized regional standards of measurement, standards that clashed directly with the federal demand for statistical standardization. Goods were packaged using traditional, descriptive volumetric containers that lacked any fixed, reliable weight. A hogshead of tobacco packed in Virginia was not necessarily the same size or weight as one packed in Maryland. A barrel of salted fish varied significantly between New England ports. And most critically, the weight of a bale of cotton, the burgeoning staple of the national economy, fluctuated wildly based on the regional pressing equipment available. The Treasury responded to this chaos of measurement with a firm administrative mandate. All official reports were to adhere to the avoirdupois system, demanding that quantities be specified in standardized federal units of pounds and tonnage, regardless of how the product was packaged by the local factor or planter. This insistence created a constant, low-level administrative friction on every major dock. The customs collectors were compelled to employ local weighmasters, often part-time workers utilizing rudimentary large-format scales, whose primary repetitive task was to translate the traditional units of local commerce into the federal standard. The official record of a shipment often required a marginal notation detailing this conversion, a silent, bureaucratic testament to the tedious, necessary negotiation between tradition and federal discipline. The flow of documentation, the actual movement from port to paper, was a multi-step procedure centered on the bill of lading and the ship's manifest. When a consignment of goods, say a load of flour barrels or tobacco hogsheads, was delivered to the port for export, the shipper generated a bill of lading, which served as a receipt and contract. The federal interest lay in the collector's mandate to verify and record the details of this document onto the official manifest. The manifest required itemized columns: the name of the vessel, the destination, the specific commodity, the declared quantity by local unit, and, crucially, the certified weight by federal unit verified on the dock scale. This paper trail was then aggregated into the port ledger, the permanent bound book maintained by the collector's chief clerk. This ledger represented the critical point of data synthesis. Hundreds of individual transaction entries, each verified and converted, were meticulously transcribed into the port ledger. The repetitive act of ruling columns, dipping the quill, and entering the figures, ensuring alignment across columns dedicated to commodity type, certified weight, and declared value, defined the rhythm of early financial bureaucracy. The clerk's work was slow, exacting, and continuous, forming the physical bridge between the chaotic reality of the dock and the symmetrical requirement of the national statistical system. The logistical challenges of data transmission further complicated the effort to establish uniformity. The collector's ledgers were compiled quarterly and sent to the Treasury in Washington, typically via post riders or coastal ships. This resulted in an inherent temporal lag. The national economic picture was always retrospective, compiled weeks or months after the goods had already reached international markets. This systematic delay was not a failure of administration, but an unavoidable constraint imposed by the primitive communication infrastructure, lending a predictable slowness to the pace of national financial analysis. Despite these procedural difficulties and the persistent administrative friction, the cumulative effect of the methodical documentation between 1801 and 1820 was the slow, continuous establishment of the first credible national commodity baselines. By the end of this period, the federal government possessed a reasonably consistent quantitative measure of the goods that underpinned its trade, specifically the volume and total weight of its exports. While these numbers were an export baseline, not a true measure of domestic production, they provided the essential quantitative foundation for policymaking. They allowed Treasury officials to reliably forecast tariff revenues, calculate the national balance of trade, and, perhaps most tellingly, to chart the ever-increasing, system-defining reliance on the production of cotton. The victory of this decade was a victory of procedure over preference. It was the triumph of the federal form over the local tradition, achieved not through revolutionary acts, but through the monotonous, patient power of continuous paperwork. The customs collector, the weighmaster, and the ledger clerk, the quiet figures of the port, had collectively established the rhythm of financial quantification, a rhythm that was steady, dry, and essential to charting the nation's economic course into the mid-19th century.
By the third decade of the 19th century, the administrative concerns of the Republic shifted definitively westward. The conclusion of the War of 1812 and the subsequent treaties with Native American nations unleashed a torrent of migration, transforming frontier settlements into burgeoning statehoods. This rapid demographic movement presented the federal government with a structural challenge far exceeding the complexities of the initial census: how to impose order and predictability upon a vast, untamed landscape that was being rapidly claimed by settlers. The solution lay in the bureaucratic linking of two distinct administrative systems: the ongoing human count and the meticulous physical measurement of space. The establishment of the Public Land Survey System, PLSS, managed by the General Land Office, GLO, was the administrative answer to the chaos of westward expansion. Unlike the haphazard land claims of the colonial era, the PLSS demanded a systematic, geometrical framework be laid across the new territories. The process was the epitome of dry, procedural diligence. It required teams of federal surveyors to venture into the wilderness armed with heavy Gunter's chains, magnetic compasses, and official instruction manuals to establish a grid of precision. This system imposed a vast, abstract geometry upon the land, defining principal meridians and baselines from which all subsequent measurements radiated. The surveyor's work was slow, repetitive, and exact. It involved the meticulous physical recording of the landscape in official field notebooks. Every segment of the chain, a distance of precisely 66 feet, was measured. Every deviation in bearing was corrected, and the location of natural features was recorded. The land was divided into 6-mile square townships, which were then further subdivided into 36 sections. The primary administrative goal was the creation of the plat map, a technical, detailed drawing that transformed the raw, organic reality of rivers and forests into a predictable, measurable grid of paper. This paper grid, defining property lines, was the foundation of all future land sales, taxation, and title deeds. While the GLO established the physical grid, the census provided the essential human layer. The censuses of 1820 and 1830 moved beyond simple head counts, incorporating detailed inquiries into occupations, manufactures, and economic output. This expanded data allowed federal administrators to do more than just count people. It allowed them to map economic necessity. By analyzing the number of millers, artisans, and merchants in a given settlement, bureaucrats could project the community's need for market access and transportation links. Justification for the massive, expensive undertakings of internal improvements. The administrative synthesis, the true linking of demographic movement and land survey, occurred in the methodical offices of the War Department, which oversaw internal improvements, and the General Land Office. Clerks were tasked with the subtle administrative operation of conceptually overlaying the demographic density charts from the census onto the rigorous topographical maps from the PLSS. This fusion of two distinct, highly detailed paper trails created a powerful predictive tool. A proposed canal route could no longer be justified by political will alone. It had to be statistically warranted by proving that it would connect sufficient productive population nodes whose growth trajectory, documented by the census, guaranteed a future return on investment. This process involved the routine production of massive, technical reports on internal improvements. A typical report justifying a new segment of a national turnpike would contain dual evidence. It would feature census tables demonstrating the rate of population growth in the adjacent counties, often meticulously calculated to 2 decimal places, followed immediately by surveyors' appendices detailing the precise topographical gradients, soil composition, and cost estimates for grading the land along the route established by the PLSS grid. This administrative friction in this system was not rooted in inconsistency of measurement, as in the customs houses, but in the demands of precision. Surveyors had to ensure their chain measurements were accurate to prevent costly boundary disputes, and GLO clerks had to ensure their plat maps were meticulously transcribed and filed. Any error in the initial siting or chaining could lead to legal chaos down the line, affecting land titles, property taxes, and the placement of infrastructure. This administrative rigor created a self-reinforcing loop. The documentation of population growth, census, provided the political and economic justification for construction, while the rigorous documentation of the land, PLSS, provided the fixed physical coordinates for construction. By 1835, the administrative grid was firmly in place. It was a procedural network that harnessed statistical information to physically restructure the American landscape. The systematic process of measuring, mapping, and correlating human settlement with physical space meant that expansion was no longer a purely organic process, but a carefully managed, statistically justified administrative act. The movement of the population and the placement of infrastructure, canals, roads, and eventual railroads were indelibly linked. The paper, the ink, and the bureaucratic persistence of the census clerks and the GLO surveyors. The creation of this grid, tedious and methodical as it was, established the procedural framework that defined the physical and economic geography of the United States for the remainder of the century. After nearly half a century dedicated to the painstaking labor of data acquisition, counting people, measuring commodities, and surveying land, the administrative challenge facing the federal government in the late 1830s was no longer simply collection, but interpretation. The Treasury and congressional offices were now custodians of vast archives of ledgers and schedules, but the raw data, by itself, offered limited utility. A profound shift was required, the procedural leap from mere enumeration to systematic analysis. This decade was defined by the attempt to institutionalize a coherent statistical methodology, a process that immediately exposed the fundamental contradiction known as the paradox of precision. The paradox of precision can be defined as the administrative decision to apply increasingly sophisticated mathematical methods to source data whose integrity remained inherently compromised by the primitive, non-uniform methods of its collection. The information gathered by marshals in the field was rough and often based on local estimation, yet the final figures presented in congressional reports were rendered to 2 or 3 decimal places, lending an air of absolute, unassailable scientific truth to fundamentally approximate numbers. The 1840 census served as the immediate catalyst for this analytical revolution. The questionnaires were expanded to capture a far more granular and complex picture of the industrializing nation, demanding intricate details on the value of manufactured goods, the classification of specific occupations, and the documentation of social variables like blindness and pauperism. The vast, heterogeneous nature of this new data rendered simple tallying obsolete. The clerical staff, the true workers of the arithmetic of statecraft, were forced to invent and apply standardized statistical procedures. The most foundational of these new methods was the calculation of the mean, or the national average. To calculate, for instance, the average wage of a factory laborer or the average output value of a farm, the clerical staff in Washington had to engage in a grueling, repetitive process. They aggregated hundreds of thousands of individual entries, the summation, and then performed the necessary division. This was patient, hand-calculated labor, utilizing no tools more advanced than the quill, the ledger, and the established rules of arithmetic. The same systematic process was applied to determine decennial growth rates and ratios of industrial engagement. The difference between the 1830 and 1840 count was subtracted and then divided by the initial value to yield a percentage rate of change, often expressed with meticulous decimal precision. This tedious, methodical work had immediate and profound implications for policy. The newly calculated figures were instantly weaponized in the era's great political conflicts. Tariff debates. Proponents of protectionism utilized the newly calculated ratios of domestic output compared to imported goods to argue for the continued necessity of high tariffs. These statistical reports offered precise numerical evidence that American industry, despite decades of growth, was still, on average, too small or too young to survive without federal protection. Financial policy. During the protracted conflicts surrounding the national bank and currency regulation, policymakers relied on complex statistical ratios detailing regional variations in lending practices and average fluctuations in currency value. These calculated figures, drawn from the painstaking analysis of bank reports and treasury data, were used to justify centralization or decentralization, depending on which side controlled the final publication of the official report. The intellectual acceptance of the paradox of precision was essential to the functioning of government. The policymakers facing complex economic and political decisions required clarity and numerical justification. The precise final figure, the product of disciplined calculation, offered this clarity, providing an unassailable empirical truth that transcended the known rough imperfections of the original source material. The administrative priority was not to reflect the messy reality of the field, but to provide the neat, symmetrical, and powerful numbers required to steer the ship of state. This decade saw the institutionalization of this analytical function. Specialized clerical segments emerged within the Treasury and the newly established congressional reporting offices, dedicated solely to statistical manipulation. The creation and publication of the statistical report became a recognized vital function of federal bureaucracy. The official report, stripped of the inconsistent handwriting of the marshals and bearing the seal of the United States, transformed raw data into the language of governance. The legacy of the 1836 to 1849 era is the permanent establishment of the quantitative lens as the primary mechanism for self-assessment. The government now spoke in the quiet, precise vernacular of the average, the ratio, and the rate of change. This administrative shift meant statecraft was no longer purely a matter of legal debate or political compromise, but a systematic, arithmetical process rooted in the slow, dry labor of calculation. The precise methodical arithmetic applied to the nation's accounts became the indispensable guide for charting the Republic's future, even as the inherent flaws of the original measurements lay quietly buried beneath the smooth, authoritative surface of the final decimal figures.
The final decade before the Civil War represented the ultimate test for the administrative architectures built over the preceding 60 years. The bureaucracy had successfully established the means for head count, economic measurement, and spatial mapping. By the 1850s, the machinery of data collection was at its most ambitious. However, this period saw the emergence of a devastating phenomenon, the politicization of statistics. Data, once a neutral tool for governance and financial forecasting, was thrust into the center of the sectional dispute, resulting in a profound crisis of data integrity that overwhelmed the clerical infrastructure designed to maintain administrative order. The 1850 census was administratively the most complex and ambitious enumeration yet undertaken. The federal government, recognizing the need for granular socioeconomic detail, made a significant administrative shift. It moved away from relying solely on the U.S. Marshals to employing a vast, temporary force of census supervisors and agents. This was an attempt to create a specialized, albeit temporary, bureaucracy dedicated solely to enumeration. The schedules were radically expanded, demanding data across 7 distinct forms, including detailed tables on agriculture, industry, mortality, and even social institutions. This administrative complexity, however, coincided with the intensifying political passion over slavery and states' rights, creating an environment ripe for clerical conflict and corruption. The temporary census agents in the field, often appointed through local political patronage, faced immense pressure to interpret or actively manipulate the data to favor regional interests. In the North, there was pressure to demonstrate the exponential superiority of free labor by inflating figures for industrial output and literacy rates. In the South, there were counter-pressures to exaggerate the value of agrarian production and to minimize mortality or disease rates among the slave population, all in an effort to statistically support the economic and moral validity of the plantation system. The resulting field data became a patchwork of intentional inconsistency. The challenges of data integrity became systemic rather than accidental. For instance, the valuation of industrial output often relied on the enumerator's subjective assessment of a local factory's total worth, a figure easily swayed by political motivation. Similarly, the detailed mortality schedules, intended to provide objective health data, were frequently skewed by Southern agents who deliberately failed to record deaths among the enslaved population, or by Northern agents who overstated poor conditions in urban centers to fuel reformist arguments. The quiet, systematic work of calculation, the arithmetic of statecraft, established in the previous decade, was immediately corrected upon application. Abolitionists seized upon calculated ratios of pauperism and illiteracy to demonstrate the moral failure of slavery. Southern political leaders responded with reports that utilized the same underlying data to prove the statistical dependency of the Northern economy on Southern cotton. The figures themselves, once symbols of methodical administrative truth, were transformed into weapons of debate. The administrative burden fell squarely upon the superintendent of the census and the clerical staff in Washington. They were tasked with analytically reconciling data that was demonstrably inconsistent, knowing that the inconsistencies were often rooted in deliberate political subterfuge rather than simple clerical error. The procedural methods, the calculation of means, medians, and rates of change, now failed to stabilize the data. The slow, tedious work of cross-checking and identifying anomalies became a desperate, inconclusive exercise, as the analytical neutrality of the central office was rendered moot by the passion of the field. The ultimate failure was not one of logistics, but of administrative neutrality. The bureaucratic apparatus, designed to quantify a unified republic for the purposes of effective governance, instead became the instrument that quantified its terminal sectional fissures.
The resulting published reports did not provide consensus. They simply provided two distinct, politically charged statistical narratives that affirmed existing prejudices and fueled the trajectory toward conflict. The decade concluded with the administrative body in deep disarray. The very foundation of federal governance, the right to know, count, and accurately represent its people and economy, had been compromised by internal political hostility. The clerical conflict exposed the fragility of administrative systems when confronted by irreconcilable political passions. The enduring legacy of the 1850 statistical efforts was not a clear picture of the nation's health, but a chilling testament to the fact that even the most rigorous, dry, and procedural paperwork can be overwhelmed by the forces of political division. The data, designed for unity, ultimately measured the distance between North and South, confirming, in meticulous statistical detail, the nation's impending break.
This long and detailed discussion of American history slowly comes to an end right here. We hope that this quiet narration has helped your mind find rest and has made your sleep even deeper and more comfortable. To listen to another dull yet important chapter from the pages of history on a future night, you may follow the channel. May every one of your nights be tranquil and restful. Good night.